Use a pair of commas to set off a word or phrase that interrupts the meaning of a sentence. Sometimes you'll write a sentence which has a main train of thought, but there's an additional fact or idea that you want to insert somewhere into the sentence because it's interesting and important, but not necessarily essential to the meaning of the sentence. We consider this group of words an interrupter, something that breaks into the main flow of the sentence. When you put in a group of words like this into a sentence which interrupts the main flow, set it off with commas, a pair of commas, one on either side. That signals to the reader, whoops, here's a little detour, don't get sidetracked, and it makes it easier for the reader to follow the complete meaning of the sentence. Here's an example. Harry Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, was born in Missouri. Now we have a group of words in the middle of the sentence here, the 33rd President of the United States, that tells a little bit more about Harry Truman. It's an interesting and important fact. But notice that it interrupts the main flow of the sentence. We can tell this because if we eliminate those words altogether, what is left still makes sense and still has the same meaning. Harry Truman was born in Missouri. We understand exactly what's being said. This person, this man named Harry Truman, was born in Missouri. Those words that are added in the middle give a little more information and help to define a bit more about who Harry Truman was, but they're not strictly necessary, and they do interrupt the main flow of the sentence. Therefore, it's appropriate to set them off with commas, to have a comma before and a comma after that group of words. And again, notice that inserting the pauses when we read the sentence makes the sentence a little easier to understand. Harry Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, was born in Missouri. Notice how the link between the subject of the sentence, Harry Truman, and the verb was becomes a little clearer when we pause to set off those words that interrupt the flow from the subject to the verb. So this is a classic example of a sentence that contains an interrupting phrase. It's good to set that off from the rest of the sentence with a pair of commas. One more example. My uncle, unlike his three brothers, never learned to drive a car. When we eliminate the words unlike his three brothers, the sentence still means the same thing and still makes sense. My uncle never learned to drive a car. Those interrupting words, unlike his three brothers, give a little more information and add an interesting fact, but they're not strictly necessary. So we consider that an interrupting group of words which ought to be set off by a comma at the beginning and a comma at the end. Don't forget that when an interrupting phrase or clause like this appears in the middle of a sentence, it needs to be set off by a pair of commas. Don't forget to put a comma at the beginning and at the end. Sometimes people make the mistake of putting a comma in one place, not the other. That's unclear. To make it clear to the reader that this is a phrase or clause that interrupts the rest of the sentence, you need to set off the entire thing with a pair of commas. Now here's a subtle variation which is important to note. Don't use commas to set off a word or phrase which is essential to understanding the meaning of the sentence. Sometimes a sentence contains a word, a phrase, a group of words which may at first glance appear to be an interrupter. But if you look closely, you realize that the word or phrase is actually essential to understanding what the sentence is saying. When that's the case, don't set it off with commas, because those words are not simply interrupting the flow of the sentence. They're an integral, important part of the flow of the sentence. So understanding the meaning of what's being said and recognizing what's essential and not essential for the meaning is actually very necessary to punctuate the sentence correctly. Let's look at this example. The historian Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote a famous book about Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, the sentence is saying that Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote this famous book, but it begins with the words, the historian. And you might then think that her name, Doris Kearns Goodwin, is a kind of interrupter. If you take away the interrupter, the sentence does still make a kind of sense. The historian wrote a famous book about Franklin D. Roosevelt. But think about what that's saying. Can we tell which historian is being talked about if we leave out the words Doris Kearns Goodwin? We really can't. Now the sentence is saying the historian wrote a famous book, but we don't know which historian, so we don't really understand what the sentence is saying. It's essential for us to understand the sentence to have those words Doris Kearns Goodwin in there. And therefore, we can't regard those words as a mere interruption. They are essential to the basic meaning of the sentence. We've got to leave them in there, and therefore we shouldn't surround them with commas. When you put a pair of commas around words or a phrase in a sentence, you're implying that those words can be ignored to a degree without changing the meaning of the sentence. That wouldn't be the case here, and therefore you don't put commas around Doris Kearns Goodwin. One more example. My Uncle Jerry is an expert driver. Once again, the name Jerry might appear at first glance to be an interrupter. But if we put commas around it, what's left outside of the commas would be, my uncle is an expert driver. And once again, we can't be sure who exactly is being spoken about. I might have several uncles, and therefore to simply say my uncle is an expert driver might leave the meaning of the sentence somewhat unclear. Since the name Jerry is essential to the meaning of the sentence, it's better not to put commas around it and instead let the sentence read as one unit. So before you put a pair of commas around an interrupting word or phrase, make sure it really does interrupt and is not essential to the meaning of the sentence. That makes an important difference to the right way to punctuate the sentence. Our next comma rule. Use a comma to separate two independent clauses that are linked with a coordinating conjunction. Now, you'll recall that independent clauses are clauses which contain both a subject and a verb and can stand alone as a sentence. An independent clause could appear as a sentence all by itself, but sometimes we do link independent clauses in larger sentences. One way of linking two independent clauses to create a larger sentence is by using a coordinating conjunction. There are 6 coordinating conjunctions: and, or, nor, for, but, and yet. Whenever you have a sentence containing 2 independent clauses joined by one of these coordinating conjunctions, it's good practice to insert a comma between the 2 clauses to separate them clearly. It puts in a pause where it's appropriate and makes the sentence a little bit easier to follow. Here's an example. French wines are considered the finest in the world, but many other countries also produce excellent wine. Here we have a sentence that is made up of 2 independent clauses. Each of the clauses here could stand alone as a sentence. French wines are considered the finest in the world. Yes, that could be a sentence by itself. Many other countries also produce excellent wine. That too could be a sentence by itself. Because the 2 ideas are closely linked, the author has decided to join them into a single sentence and use the coordinating conjunction but as the connector. And that makes perfect sense. Notice that a comma is necessary before the conjunction but. It puts a pause between the 2 independent clauses, which separates them. It makes it a little easier to follow the logic of the sentence, and it warns the reader, slow down a bit because we're about to change course, just like a yield sign on a highway. So when we pause slightly in reading that sentence, it's a little easier to understand, and the pause makes sense with the shift in meaning that's about to begin. So when you have 2 independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction, use a comma as well. Here's an exception to the rule. Omit the comma if both independent clauses are very short. In some cases, you might write a sentence that contains 2 or even more independent clauses that are all very short and joined with coordinating conjunction. If that's the case, you can usually omit the comma because the effect works perfectly well to read straight through when the clauses are very short. Here's a simple example. I hear and I obey. Here we have 2 independent clauses. I hear, I obey. And they're joined by the coordinating conjunction and. You could put a comma before the conjunction and if you want, but because the clauses are so short and the sentence is so quick and easy to read and understand, it doesn't really seem to be necessary. So this is an exception to the rule. You can omit the comma if both clauses are very short.